I discovered earlier today when I looked at my name tag that I theoretically am the host of this event, and I'm also supposed to introduce Brian to you all. During my tenure at the University of Pittsburgh as chairman of the department, and also during my 19 years as provost at Mercyhurst University, I've had the opportunity of introducing a variety of scholars who are at various stages of retirement. These included Alex Spohr, whom most of you know, who had as his field crew not only the Dark Lord at Kincaid, but also Robert Braidwood, Bill Hague, and sundry others. So, needless to say, what I did at that time was to try and figure out how the individuals that I was presiding over, their retirements, changed the way we look at the world. And certainly, Brian has done that. In his 26 or 30 odd books, he has certainly changed the way archaeologists look at the world. And I think he would agree that that was the purpose of most of them. Most of the documents which he has produced were in fact designed, I'm hesitant to say this, to change people's minds about one thing or another. I certainly approve of that approach. I have been accused of being guilty of it myself. Nonetheless, without further ado, this is Brian Fagan speaking to us remotely.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There is silence.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
probably.
We can hear you. We can hear
You
you.
can hear. Okay. Now here we go. I'm very flattered indeed to be asked to give this talk, but I want to begin with an apology. Unfortunately, I have been unable to travel for medical reasons, so the only way I can appear is remotely using the miracle medias which we now have. So I do apologize for not being with you in person, and I really miss it because this isn't really a substitute. So I begin with an apology. And what I'm going to do today is talk about a very wide-ranging set of questions to do with climate change and ancient climate change, because for the last 20 years or so,
Recording in progress.
I spent a great deal of time writing about and thinking about climate change, not on a local level, but more on a global level, and not from the scientific point of view, nor have I been trying to prove that humanly made climate change is a fallacy, and nor have I stressed North America at the expense of Europe and so on. I've tried to take a very general view of it. And that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to talk about all kinds of different types of climate change in rather general terms, partly to entertain us, because at a meeting like this, you end in a suitably celebratory mood. And secondly, because I am extremely interested in these very general issues, because very often archaeology has become so specialized and narrow that it's very difficult to see the broader picture, which has been my specialty, if that's the right word, ever since I started off in archaeology as a kid in tropical Africa. But that is where I'm going to start this evening, because of all the experiences in my career. I would say that 8 years in Africa was very, very fundamental. I spent months every year in the bush, and really out in the bush, I mean, I was seeing stuff while I was digging that tourists pay $10,000 a week to see these days. Elephants, game of all kinds, and also had the privilege of living among subsistence farmers who really were living harvest to harvest. And I would say of all the experiences I've had, that has been the one that really has changed the way I look at the world.
Now try to reshare it and see if
Here we are. We're in business.
it's working now.
Yes.
Okay.
And
Reshare.
I'm going to start this talk with one of the great eruptions of history.
You're
the
gonna
eruption
need to reshare so we can see.
Sumatra and Southeast Asia blew into space. And all that was left at the end was this lake you see here, which is the former peak of the volcano. This spread ash over an enormous area of tropical Asia, Eurasia, and South Asia. How much is a matter of debate. But this was an event which must have caused major changes in climate over probably 10 years or more. And it's only recently that we've discovered how important volcanoes were for the study of climate change and what effects they had. So I thought I'd begin with this dramatic event and just point out that really the modern study of climate change, in the sense that we are looking at in detail, really begins about in the late Ice Age, about 75,000 years ago. Now I'm moving you to Central Africa. I want to take a quick look at the realities of subsistence farming in Central Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, millions of people still live this way today, and we have no understanding at all as lay people of the complexities of subsistence agriculture, because everything depends on one word: rainfall. And the lives of these people is wrapped up in waiting for rain. The Middle Zambezi Valley, which is about 200 miles or more downstream of the well-known Victoria Falls, is a low-altitude environment. It's at about 3,000 feet above sea level. And when it's a cool day, the temperature is about 75. And the temperatures before rain comes get higher and higher. These people live on cereal agriculture and cattle, and they operate entirely with hand tools like hoes and axes. And much of the agriculture is done, as it is in this picture, by women. It is a very, very tough form of existence. And everything depends on two things. One is the flood of the Zambezi River, because these people live on the floodplain of it, which unfortunately, even at its highest point, is too low to allow them to get water from it, because they have no means of lifting water. They don't have pumps. They couldn't use shadoofs like the ones used in ancient Egypt. So they relied almost entirely on rainfall from the heavens. And in September and October every year, the temperatures rose. And literally, you could move a finger and you would sweat. And we would sit under the eaves of the houses, which were built of thatch and sticks. And you would just sit there and we would watch the eastern horizon for signs of accumulating rain. Temperatures rose. Our tempers rose. People often fought for no reason. It was very tough because everybody was waiting for that magical moment of rain. And it was, ironically, at this moment of the highest temperatures of the year that the people had to clear the fields. And what they did was to burn off the growth on their old fields, let the ash fall onto the vegetation, and then spread it over their plots. And then they would wait, and they would wait, and they would wait. And some years, you saw the clouds coming, and the people planted their cereals, mainly sorghum and millet. And then they would wait, and they would wait. And some years, you didn't get rain till November. In other years, the rain came in September, and it kept going, which was wonderful. But the whole tempo of life depended on when this rain came and the planting of the fields. And it's very interesting that these people have a very close relationship with the natural environment. And the one thing I learned here was the enormous power of ancestors, the people who came before, because the people believe that the people who went before, the ancestors, are the guardians of the land, which is true of many subsistence farming societies around the world. And every time there was a village meeting, or a funeral, or a ceremony of any time, the first thing that happened was that the spirit medium of the village invoked the ancestors, and they clapped their hands, and they sang, and they danced. When you died, your body was taken to the bush and buried. Sometimes it was cremated. And then there was, after a year, an all-night drumming, where the spirit of that ancestor was brought back to the village to be one of the revered ancestors of the land. This, to put it mildly, was a tough existence. And I will never ever forget living in the same community as malnourished children, and with elders like this older woman who had almost nothing to eat. And you realized how dependent people were on each other. And this whole rhythm of subsistence agriculture became and has been one of the preoccupations of my looking at climate change ever since. It was very lucky to have this experience when I was in my 20s. When I had this, and this is the thing I want to really stress, secondly, is that climatology, paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climate, is a very recent form of research. Back right up until probably literally World War I or a little more, all weather forecasting was what one British meteorologist, who rejoiced in the name of Hubert Lamb, called church steeple meteorology. Because what you would observe would be the weather phenomena, particularly the clouds and the winds from the highest point around, which very often was a church tower or a hill. And even if you were a sailor in the North Sea or somewhere like that, the total scope of your experience and your forecasting was estimated, educated guesswork based on observations of the sea, of the land. And you have to remember that people in fishing boats, for example, lived a mere 2 foot above the water, not like us. And then in the 20th century came the big revolution in climatology, of which the most famous probably is the tree rings, top right, which were developed, that idea or the research was developed by an astronomer called A.E. Douglas in the American Southwest, where he produced climatic curves which extend back quite impressively now to about 10,000 years ago. And now we have, for the last 2,000 years in Europe, very good data on seasonal climate. Then for the longest ago, there were pollen grains. Many of them were covered from Scandinavian bogs and swamps, which again could be made into sequences of changing vegetation as the climate changed. There was more rainfall, there was less rainfall, it was cooler. You found that there were pollen diagrams, and they began to match those with locations, say, from Scandinavia to Spain. And this is still done with great success and with sophistication. And then lastly, one of the most recent, but really rather dramatic because it's logistically complicated, is the whole issue of ice cores, deep sea cores from the oceans and from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica. And those have pushed back general pictures of global climate during the Ice Age for about 4,000 years. Now, this all sounds very nice at a rather abstract level, but just think about it at a more detailed level. Have you ever heard a really good violinist play a Stradivarius violin? If I could see the audience, and I wish I could, I'm sure a few of you are nodding, because it really is a very special experience. Permit me to introduce you to this violin, which is called the Messiah. They're all named, they are valued millions of dollars. And some years ago, a project was developed to date a number of Stradivarius violins, of which this is one, called the Messiah, because they didn't know that it was genuine. They thought it might be a forgery, and that this was not made by Stradivarius. You can see him at the top, by somebody else. And they took the Messiah and they took samples from other violins and from trees in the Alps. And not only did they show that it was the same age in the 17th century, but they showed that the Messiah's timber came from the same tree as another one. So you can get that precise, and that's what makes a lot of climate change really fascinating. Just to give you a little guide very quickly, the yo-yo of climate change over the last 2,000 years has truly been very dramatic in a way. There were two big periods. The first one is one called the medieval warm period, or the medieval climatic anomaly, which is of great interest, particularly in North America and in Europe, because it was a period of warmer temperatures, higher rainfall, higher sea levels, which was particularly important actually in Southwest Florida, and they've done some superb work on humans and sea levels down in that area. And then there's the well-known Little Ice Age in Europe, which in the 17th century was pretty chilly, and that's when they had the famous fairs in England on the River Thames. This is what the medieval warm period was like. Generally, higher snow lines, longer growing seasons, slightly higher summer temperatures, and drier warm months. And this is what a lot of people love, wine was grown in England and northern Germany. And in fact, this trend lasted for quite a while, but it wasn't a period where everything was warm, period. It was a period where there were a lot of very warm summers, there were a lot of wet and cold summers, there were dry summers, and so on. It was Europe at its most valuable. But the most interesting thing about it was that the climate never stayed the same, and generally it was as warm, if not warmer than today. And of course, the climate change deniers are trying to go around saying, the medieval warm period was, of course, the period when it was warmer than today, therefore climate change caused by humans is nonsense. That is garbage. This is a period which is marked in people's minds by prosperity, ample harvests, plentiful beer, and general prosperity. This is a very famous painting by an artist called Bruegel from Holland, and it's remarkably realistic. The problem with it is that, in fact, this dates to the Little Ice Age. It does not date to the medieval warm, but it does show the reality of agriculture. Because the thing people forget, and I wrote years ago a book called The Little Ice Age about the Little Ice Age. One of the things people picked up on was the fact that I said, hello, have you forgotten that 1,000 years ago, nearly everybody in Europe lived from one harvest to the next? They'd forgotten. They lived in a sort of idealized world of medieval harvests and apple-cheek peasants and so on, which is, of course, part of the image. But in fact, it was a very brutal time. And here is the best reconstruction of this I've ever found, which is actually an English reconstruction of the reality of subsistence agriculture. They had a horse. It was used to tow harrows and plow shallow furrows. But the grain itself was planted and scattered by hand. You can see the man there doing it. And this process was crude and very low yielding. So it really was a question that if you didn't get good rain, you were hungry. And this is a photograph of a picture of a medieval woman, probably in her 20s. You can see the suffering etched into her face. These people, all of them, experienced hunger, malnutrition, and shortages of food. Their life expectancy, about the age of 28. And it's very interesting because during this period that more than half Europe's forests vanished, many of them cleared by monastic communities, because religious beliefs had a very, very strong hold on populations, and they received propaganda in the form of sermons from local preachers saying, if you don't do this, you don't do that, you will be condemned to eternal damnation and eternal fire, which of course was nonsense. But following this, a number of things happened. Half Europe's forests vanished, and there were permanent, serious consequences for farmers in water, fertility of the soil, rotation of crops, and so on. And it is a miracle that we did give so long. Another well-known feature of the medieval warm anomaly was that of the Norse. And immediately many of you, particularly if you're older, will think of Kirk Douglas's famous movie, The Viking, which is garbage. It paints a heroic picture of a hero and luxury and all the rest. The Norse, as they're known as, were in fact very warlike, very quarrelsome, but they're also remarkable people. I remember traveling in a ship which was quite large from Greenland, from Newfoundland to Greenland, on a day when it was blowing 40 to 50 miles an hour, and I suddenly realized I was sitting in the coffee bar drinking coffee, looking out. It was a beautiful day. It was sunny and everything, windy as hell. I suddenly realized that the Vikings had sailed to Greenland in open boats in these conditions. These were tough people. But they weren't just warriors. They were, above all, merchants. And one of the most remarkable pieces of archaeology done in recent years has been the reconstruction of 3 or 4 Viking ships, which were types of different craft. This, for example, was the load carrier, the Ranar, which was, above all, a merchant ship. It would carry cattle, it would carry grain, and these traveled seriously, regularly across to Greenland from Europe. And the seamanship to do this and the navigation was quite extraordinary, and a great deal of it was experience passed from one generation to the next. Look at the scale of these voyages. And you've got one set of voyages here on the right, which are down the North Sea to England, to Ireland, and right down as far as the Loire River in France, because believe it or not, what they traded there and obtained was salt. Salt was in very high demand for agriculture. They also waded across the North Sea, and they also voyaged in voyages of exploration, which took them to the Orkney Islands, to the Shetland, to the Faroe Islands, and to Iceland. And from there, they did sail across to Greenland, and how far down they went into Labrador and Newfoundland, we don't know. But there is evidence of a Viking settlement settled, and they found this anyway recently, in about 965 by Vikings. Why did they do this? Because the ice conditions in the North Atlantic were particularly favorable because the pack ice retreated. And it also emerged among the Norse that one of the most exciting things about some towns like this is a modern Norwegian town, was the fact that fish absolutely teemed in these waters. Particularly a friend of ours, Gadus mohua, the Atlantic cod. This fish is enormously prolific. It has white, firm flesh, which preserves very well, particularly with the use of salt. It's a bottom fish and was available in extraordinary quantities. And if you go through many Norse villages in Labrador now, you will still see the drying racks where they've fished and then they leave them gutted out on these racks to dry. And in the old days, they used to traffic enormous quantities of this salted fish into Europe from the Atlantic. And in fact, this was an extremely lucrative form of trade. Much of it fueled by, of all things, Christian doctrine that fish were eaten on Fridays, and that Fridays and Lent were meatless periods, which had an enormous effect on, among other things, monastic diet. There are your cod. And cod are fun because you make a recipe out of these. You've got to be pretty basic because traditional recipes, they say, lay out the fish, hammer it hard for 20 minutes, which softens it. Then you cook it, and the result is quite delicious. But this stuff went all the way down into the Mediterranean. It went right across the Black Sea. It traveled right through Europe, and it was very extensive in parts of North America. Kind of the closest equivalent would be the fur trade in later centuries. This is still an enormously important trade. Unfortunately, the Atlantic has been overfished, and the result is that much of the trade has collapsed. It's now under strict control, which may or may not enable it to survive. The scale of fishing in medieval Europe and during the Little Ice Age and the medieval one was extraordinary. And one of the things which is fascinating is that we're now finally getting an idea of what the boats that did this were. I mean, everyone's familiar with canoes, but how often are they used to the idea, or do they think about fishing in open water? This boat, known in medieval times as a dogger, is completely unknown. The only pictures of it are some crude carvings on English church walls. But they found little bits of them, and it appears that they were 60-foot open boats with sails, you can see them there, which enabled them to stay close to the wind, more or less stationary while they fished. And they fished over the edge for cod. When the ship was full, they turned around and went back to Europe and came out again. The casualty rate was enormous, up to 20% or more. But the most fascinating thing about this trade is that the boats just vanished. Why? Because they were like a lot of little Hummer fishing boats you see rotting in the mud. They did their job, and then they were just thrown away. Where did they work? They worked in the North Atlantic between Norway and Iceland and into Greenland. This is a picture I took off the south coast of Iceland, taken in November. These guys in those open boats, they were based mainly in either in Iceland or in England, sailed out into the Atlantic against the prevailing winds and stayed out there fishing in open boats for 2 months or more at a time in midwinter. These were tough people. The definitions of how tough it was like, on the risks that one took and so on, have been completely redefined since those days. But it's worth thinking briefly, and this is true of climate, agriculture too, that the risks people take have to be very high, and they tend to be extremely conservative in their thinking and practice. And this is something that many archaeologists tend to forget. We're very influenced by our modern view of life, and that's wrong. You see, the thing about climate change is that it isn't just something that happens. I mean, we're going to get an El Nino, for which most people on the West Coast are saying, whoopee, we'll get some rain. But in fact, it's far more complicated than that. Think of a pebble thrown into a calm pond. There's a plop, and then radiating circles of ripples radiate from the point of impact, and gradually the water becomes a silvery calm again. Now, the consequences of El Niños are the social and economic and other ripples, political, whatever you like, caused by the impact. And these ripples you see here are the things you really got to look at, because the causes of an El Nino are very, very numerous. And you can't say that Maya civilization was caused by climate change. All you can look at is the record of climate, which they're now doing with building roads and all sorts of things, you can now begin to trace how the changes took place. And we found, for example, in 10th century AD, there were a whole series of periods when there were intense droughts, and they went away. And the people were constantly having to adapt to these major drought incidents. And there's no question that a great deal of the difficulties which later Maya societies had with just existing was climate change. But what is also emerging is that they're now finally studying modern Maya agriculture. As they are in the southwest, they are in Africa. And we realized that these people adapted brilliantly to extraordinarily complex environments. And they did so with the experience of their forebears, which was preserved by oral tradition, by practice, and so on, over hundreds of years. And there may have been high death rates and so on, but in fact, they survived. What's it going to be like in the future? The media are having a marvelous time. Everything is casualties, people dying, impending doom. And it's almost as if we live in a zone of time where we make our living by making doomsday predictions. This is missing the point. The point is that we are living in a period of warming temperatures. Question 1. How do we adapt to these? We've hardly started looking. Secondly, this is a flooded series of rivers, of fields in the River Severn Valley in England. This is an area about 30 miles long, about 10 miles wide. Can you reconstruct the climate of medieval Britain from that? Hell no. But it gives you some idea of the complexity, because the one thing I've learned about climate change is that it is almost invariably talk about late ice ages, major El Niños, earthquakes, but in the final analysis, the impact is local. It's on a village, on a community, on a family, on an army in battle, and so on. And I always think about climate change in the context of an experience I had in the Zambezi Valley many, many years ago when I was a young boy. I went walking by the Zambezi River, which has got the most beautiful Galloway forests. And I was walking, and suddenly, not quite as close as these guys, I found myself in the middle of a herd of elephants. And I stood still. And they ignored me, just went on with their thing. And eventually, I was there for about 2 hours. It was fascinating. They vanished. And I realized that climate change, like that elephant, life will go on. And it will be quiet very often. And you will have people having spasms about poached elephants, which is true, and things like that. But the real thing we have to realize is that the one thing that our forebears mastered, which we really haven't yet, is the art of living in their environments. And I remember talking to an African foreman I have and his father, who took me round his small farm. And they said, well, of course, this glass will be gone in 2 weeks. And I said, what do you mean? Looked at me just like other glass. He said, looked at me and said, think, my cattle are about to eat it. And 2 weeks later they did. And one really learned. And we have the tapestry of history. And one of the tapestries is of medieval times, these enormous rogation ceremonies which interceded with God to make sure that our sins were forgiven. This form of dealing with climate change is now, of course, long out of date. Although every time we have a major catastrophe, like a superstorm or big hurricane, sure as eggs or eggs, you're going to find headlines in the paper that X and Y preachers are talking about God's anger. It's not. It's the variability of a society, of a climate to which we have to adapt. And the biggest lesson of all this is that we are powerless in the face of climate change. All we can do is develop skills to adapt to it, like these little Ice Age villagers did in Holland in late medieval times. They developed skates, they fished through the ice, they hunted animals like birds with bows and arrows, and they fished. And they survived, partly because their crops were adapted to conditions like this. Then, of course, there was the fun of it, and I mentioned earlier the little Ice Age in Europe with its Christmas fairs. Here they are, here are the booths, here are the people. There were brothels, there were dances, there were fights, there were races, there was even ice sailing, you can see it there. And this appeared, and directly the ice began to melt, it vanished. And in 17th century, London had huge ice fairs, which haven't been seen since the 18th century. And we've increasingly learned that volcanoes are part of the scene. One of the most famous is this one, when Mount Tambora, again, the one that erupted in 73,000 years ago, erupted again and gave us such heavy cloud cover that there really wasn't a summer in Europe. It was known as the year without a summer. But the most famous fallout of this, and there were all kinds of fallouts in the climate. But the lady on the left, Mary Shelley, she was the wife of a poet called Percy Bysshe Shelley, and they took a summer in a villa in Switzerland. And one of the effects of subsistence agriculture is, of course, that you are very vulnerable to hunger. And large areas of Europe were suffering from famine during 1816, 1815. And Mary Shelley sat in their place, shivering by the fire, and wrote the story of Frankenstein, an immortal consequence of climate change. What I've done today is given you a few ranging thoughts on climate change, which I hope have been of interest. I have been superficial because today's climate change has very high stakes as far as survival of polar bears, for example, or lions, and of our own ability to survive. But the encouraging thing to me is that we as humans have the intelligence and the ability to adapt. And the more we concentrate on adaptation, the better off we will be. And so many of the things we think about today are just downright irrelevant. and silly. For example, we've just discovered that there were intense cold periods in the British Columbia coastline mountains between 1750s and 1820s to 1830s. And now they're correlating this event with other things that happen elsewhere. It's fascinating. The history of China alone is being rewritten because they're discovering a great deal about droughts in the Yangtze River. In the Yangtze River area in 1877, people were selling their babies in the streets. Over 1 million Chinese perished. In India, the same thing. In the streets, there were scenes of unbelievable suffering. And a lot of people just wandered aimlessly looking for water and food. Many of them died, and you can see here a pile of chaps, of corpses taken by a Christian missionary photographer. And up at the right, you can see British Raj officials handing out food. At the time when this was going on, and millions died, Britain was exporting grain from India to Europe to support cheaper prices of grain on a global basis. Our world has moved on to some degree, but the most dangerous thing we can do is to neglect what is happening, to think it's not important, when it is. It's the most vital thing that we face. How are we going to feed people in 100 years? Because one of the fascinating things about the history of hunting, if you look at hunting, you find there was a period of about 40 years in the 19th century where Americans, sport tourists, and Europeans slaughtered enormous quantities of game. Why? No one really knows. They just slaughtered it. I think a lot of it was they wanted trophies on their walls. But it's a very sobering reflection of the fragility of those climates, because the hunters soon discovered that this was not an insatiable resource. It was a finite resource. And one of the big lessons we've had to learn, and still learning, is that food of all kinds and the environment is a very precious, precious thing. Let's look just very quickly at these medieval droughts. We know now that there's been a 25% increase in global drought since 1990. Within a century, extreme drought will affect 30% of the world, up from 3%. Severe drought will affect 40%, up from 8%. And moderate drought will affect 50%, up from 25%. And if you look at some of the fascinating stuff that's been discovered now about droughts and how they ripple through different societies in the 19th century, it's amazing. And this is just the beginning. Am I writing a doomsday scenario? No. But I'm telling you facts. There will be 130 million Asians suffering food shortages by 2050. Reduce of rice yields by 5 to 12%. Catastrophic hunger in Africa by 2080 because there will be no wheat. Heat waves and fires in Australia and New Zealand, which are already happening. We have a frightening series of scenarios. And what's interesting, just like African game, an awful lot of this, and the warning signs, which are very clear, we have chosen to ignore. How much longer are we going to be able to do this? The encouraging thing is that we are Homo sapiens, the wise people. We planned and innovate and rise to the challenge, but never to such long-term challenges as those of the new era of drought. But I believe the past tells us that we'll prevail. And now a final word from our medieval friends. We should never forget them and the lessons we've learned from them. No word. Time for a drink. Thank you. Now I have to
Dr. Fagan, can